Medieval-inspired worlds are very prevalent in all media, especially video games. The high fantasy setting of many games draws much of its setting from feudal Europe, and the music of these games reflects that. However, some games take it a step further and use music that is truly inspired by the music of medieval times, and you can pinpoint the genres and pieces that the composers drew from. Even games that aren't fantasy or medieval at all take notes from this era of music. So let's dive into some medieval music history and see game music that fits into the various genres of the time. Also, for the sake of this episode, we will be talking about medieval music in Europe and not other parts of the world. Also, I will be talking about actual medieval music because a lot of the music that people think of regarding knights, kings, and horses is from movies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that have very much modernistic music but are about the Middle Ages. First off, how do we even know what medieval music sounds like? It was the Dark Ages, right? Well, the written records are far fewer than in later eras, and musical notation wasn't as universal as it became in around the 1700s, but we do know a good bit about music from the year 500 to 1400 or so. In the medieval era, there were two main categories, sacred and secular, and many categories within those with some overlap. The most simple is definitely plain chant, specifically the Gregorian chant. It's monophonic, meaning that there was no harmony or accompaniment, just a single line of text and music that everyone sang. It's named after Saint Gregory I, who was pope whenever the chants were collected and codified. These chants led to organum, which is, at its most simple, essentially a Gregorian chant but with some kind of vocal accompaniment, usually a single drone note or a note in parallel motion. The best examples of these chants in a game is most certainly the beginning of the opening suite to the Halo games. The rest of the piece is very percussion heavy and modern, but that opening is very medieval. Actually, that's a common theme in modern day music trying to sound medieval. We've come so far in terms of ensemble since then that few composers make music that is exactly akin to medieval music. In medieval music, especially early medieval music, if it was polyphonic, that is more than one note at any given time, then it still usually had only one or maybe two instruments. Now let's look into some games and see what kind of music they use and how it reflects the medieval times. The Civilization games use music from the period of time that you're currently in the game, and since the medieval era is a relatively long period of time, medieval music tends to stick out in my mind more when I think about that game. As I was researching music from this era, I heard lots of not only music, but sounds that reminded me a lot of Civilization. Skyrim's, and by extension Morrowind's, main world music is again more modernistic with its percussion, subtlety, and soundscapes. It is very much inspired by medieval music, but far too complex to truly fit the era. Except that is the Inn and Bard songs. A Winter's Tale, which is incidentally my wake-up song, and The Bannered Mare are pretty medieval with their simple rhythm and few instruments. The songs that the bard sings are very much like troubadours of the time, just a single person singing with a lute or small harp. Almost every track of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles soundtrack uses ancient instruments such as the lute, recorder, and crumhorn in its music, so it's very medieval and Renaissance feeling. Some of the tracks are very much Japanese video game and more modern feeling, but almost all of the traveling and town music is straight out of the late medieval and early Renaissance era, matching the setting of the game. This is one of my favorite game soundtracks, by the way. Rogue Legacy, the reason I made this episode, and part of the reason why it's so late, has a very Castlevania-esque soundtrack, which is very much more Baroque than medieval, but that's another episode. However, the music when choosing a new descendant and upgrading your manor is straight out of the Middle Ages. Then there are games that aren't strictly fantasy, but based in medieval Europe, or something trying to be medieval Europe. Mountain Blade has a soundtrack that has both traditional Hollywood medieval music with soaring trumpets and violins, and music that sounds more like actual medieval music with simple melodies and harps, usually without accompaniment. Crusader Kings 2 is very similar to Mountain Blade in that regard, although its opening theme features chanting. Vocals are actually pretty prominent in the soundtrack, which is surprisingly uncommon in video games, but it makes sense since the overwhelming amount of surviving medieval pieces are vocal. Assassin's Creed, the first one that is in the medieval times, and you can hear the influence, but it's way more Middle Eastern than European. Stronghold has really good medieval-inspired music, with some tracks being more modern percussion-heavy type that one would expect, but some pieces that are purely vocal and only have one or two instruments with simple melodies. Most games feature a very percussion-heavy and Hollywood-inspired medieval world, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love that kind of music. But it's amazing to hear how the composers drew inspiration from the music of the actual Middle Ages. Listen for the simple melodies and vocal emphasis whenever you're playing something based on medieval Europe, and I hope that you'll be able to pick out which composers really put more effort into the authenticity. So go out, play those games, and listen well.